Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Eric Rush. I'm sitting in the host chair today for Don, and I am joined today by my two friends, Chris and Dylan. So, Chris, would you like to say hi to the good people?
Hi, good people.
And Dylan, please introduce yourself. How you like to be introduced?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the rabbit hole.
And a rabbit hole we do have for everybody today. This is going to be a little bit of a different fork in time. Usually, it's more a single event or a single group of events that lead us to a fork and a particular set of decisions here. This is going to be a little bit different, but I think it's something that that the audience will actually really enjoy, and it kind of harkens back to the live feed. So for those of you who are longtime listeners, will recall that in the fall of 2022, as I recall, we did a live stream event that was really good fun. I think Dylan wasn't quite part of the team yet. He came on pretty quickly after that, but I sure had a blast on the live stream. And one of the things that we talked about on the live stream was our favorite conspiracy theory. And my favorite conspiracy theory was and remains to this day that there is no such thing as Wyoming. That Wyoming simply does not exist, and nobody so far has been able to prove to me that Wyoming exists. And so I will maintain my conspiracy theory. However, since Dylan was not yet part of the core Fork in Time team, he did not have the opportunity to share his favorite conspiracy theory with the group. But that changes today. And so today we're going to talk about one of Dylan's favorite conspiracy theories, I guess we'll say, or something that's been a topic of interest for him over the past few months. And we'll let him kind of run with that. So it'll be a little bit different, but I think the audience will really enjoy it. I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to introduce that in just a second, but I do want to put in a plug for our next live stream. We don't know exactly what the date is going to be, but it's going to coincide with episode 200. And again, it'll be a live episode. You'll get to see a little bit about not just the episode itself, but you'll also get to experience sort of the team bantering beforehand. And so we've talked before, we usually spend about 15 or 20 minutes before the episode actually records, just talking to each other. Some of it's about the episode, some of it's just about life. And the reason being is because we have all become friends with one another through the podcast, which has been fantastic. And so we just enjoy talking with one another. So without further ado, Dylan, would you like to introduce your favorite conspiracy theory and what we're going to do with that today?
Yes. So we are going to talk today about the sovereign citizen movement. This is not so much a conspiracy theory as the Rat King of conspiracy theories. If you are not familiar with a Rat King, those of you who may not be intimately involved in the New York City sewer system, a Rat King is essentially a bunch of rats that somehow through their sort of dirty, living conditions have gotten entangled together and become functionally one mass. And that is basically what the sovereign citizen movement is. This is a group of conspiracy theories that have gotten tangled together to the point where they're essentially all interconnected into one vast conspiracy network. The short version, in as much as this can be shortened, is that this is a movement or a group of people that believe, for whatever reason, there are several common reasons, but there's also all kinds of different ones, that the government is illegitimate of the United States or other countries. We can get into that too. There's some international flavors to this, but they believe that for whatever reason, the government is illegitimate and it has been replaced by a sort of shadow nefarious government that is doing all kinds of different evil schemes that essentially boil down to the laws don't apply to them, the taxes are illegitimate, international trade and monetary systems are a scheme, and just kind of go off from there. These are movements that unfortunately tend to have a lot of either anti-Semitic or racist or supremacist of one form or another kind of variations as part of this whole illegitimacy argument, or because of the historical background of some of these. So that's what we're going to explore today. I primarily experienced this through the legal background, which is where a lot of people will know this from, but there are also some significant historical examples that we're going to get into, especially for the history of the United States, especially in the 80s and 90s, is really when this movement kind of became part of the sort of national zeitgeist, if you will, although it's kind of taken a back burner lately. Basically, what a sovereign citizen sort of started out as is these sort of anti-tax protest movements from the 1970s and even before that. Some of the earliest ones were people may be familiar with the Posse Comitatus, which is a group of almost old-timey sheriff's aficionados in the 1970s, especially out west. They basically believed that the sheriff was the highest form of legitimate government, and that the sheriff could deputize basically whoever he wanted in a Wyatt Earp style, posse to essentially dish out frontier justice to anyone who had wronged other citizens under the quote-unquote common law, which, to take a little legal detour, is not the common law that we may be familiar with from English and American jurisprudence, but this is their own special thing. These guys refused to pay taxes. They committed some violence and threats against, local officials back then. Came out of some of these white supremacist movements, the early versions of the Aryan Nation, Christian nationalist movements. The most probably famous incident here is they attempted an arrest in 1983 of a guy named Gordon Call in Montana, I believe. And then that led to a shootout. A couple people died, and they didn't catch him until a couple months later in Arkansas when he was shot and killed. That's kind of a common theme, shootouts and standoffs and various things. Later in the 1990s, you have events like Ruby Ridge, where there's another federal standoff between a guy who refused to pay his taxes, and probably most famously, the Waco Branch Davidian standoff, where David Koresh and some of his followers, that was more of an inspiration than a true sovereign citizen sort of event in and of itself, but definitely inspired fuel of these kind of, anti-government oppressive feelings that were coming in the 90s, and ultimately kind of culminated in the Oklahoma City bombing. Right. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols,
which I think all of us remember very well. So Dylan, I have a question for you. So you had mentioned it, and I'd read this book myself, that a lot of these folks will view the highest legitimate form of government as the sheriff. So I'm curious as to kind of how they square that circle, considering the process of which we elect a sheriff is in most jurisdictions very similar to the process we elect anybody else. So what is unique about the sheriff as being a legitimate officer of the government, whereas everybody else is an illegitimate officer of the government?
Well, so part of it comes out of the sort of history of kind of the late 19th century Wild West, when a lot of these rural areas out west, which is where this movement starts, were coming into the fore and were kind of developing. The sheriff basically at the time was the primary law enforcement officer that was directly chosen by the people. When actually back then they were appointed by the governor, but we're not going to tell these people that because they're not going to listen. But the sheriff is basically seen like, in a world where there are few direct conduits between the people and their form of government, the sheriff is the kind of local, avatar of the people's justice, if you will. So that's why they see the sheriff as opposed to the mayor or the governor or some of these other people as sort of their symbol, if you will, because the sheriff historically has this power to enable the citizens to take their own justice, which, when you see most of the government as illegitimate, is a very attractive power the sheriff can bestow upon you to seek your own justice. And a lot of these people would even set up fake courts where they will hold dummy trials and find, especially local actual public officials, guilty of various, real or legitimate crimes for various fake acts or acts of official duties. So it's all kinds of just both a metaphorical and a literal Wild West that this movement kind of develops into. And there's all kinds of flavors to it, which is the other thing, is there's not just one version of this. This is the historical precedent, but today there's probably at least 5 or 6 versions of this that you can commonly find all across America that are related to this, but separate and distinct brands of it, if you will.
And each of them have their own kind of set of reasons for the illegitimacy of the government, it sounds like, although there are some common themes there too. And one of the things I've noticed is there's a lot of symbolism as a part of this movement. Can you talk about that a little bit at all, Dylan, about kind of the types of symbols and the way those are sort of used in this? And I'm thinking specifically about things like a gold fringe on an American flag means something very specific. Things like that.
Yeah. So a lot of because this is a conspiracy theory like any other, a lot of it tends to involve symbolism, various iconography and things like that. You will commonly hear in modern sovereign citizen belief things like, the gold fringe on the flag. So just to give people some background, frequently in military areas, courts of law, federal buildings, especially the American flag that is on display has a gold fringe around it. And normally in sort of the common day-to-day experience, you will frequently see that fringe on military vessels and, offices. It's not what they fly from the flagpole, but, on board military ships and in international waters aboard marine vessels of the United States. So the sovereign citizens believe that this gold fringe, when you see it, it's a secret sign that the actual jurisdiction is admiralty. It's international law. It's made up. It's not the real law that applies. It's this illegitimate government oppressing you by forcing you to conform to international admiralty and international monetary law instead of the quote unquote common law that the sheriff would enforce based on the natural rights of the people from a sort of, Rousseau and Hobbes and sort of English political theory that is the true law of natural rights from your old Jeffersonian days. So people will think that you have to, ask permission that from the judge if you want to enter a courtroom. It's analogized to, when you step on the ship, the captain has to permit you. So it's another symbol, the judge allowing you to come into the courtroom. So they think that all of this is a secret symbol, that they don't actually have to, that this law is imposed on them. It's not actually something that they ascribe to. It's essentially forced upon them. You'll also see things like, depending on your strain of sovereign citizen belief, you'll see things like the all-seeing eye from Masonic symbols, which ties into sort of Illuminati conspiracy theories. You'll see, some Islamic and African nationalist variants. You'll see sort of the crescent and star from, the symbols of Islam. You'll see, the Gadsden flag. Don't tread on me is a very popular one, not just among sort of the libertarian American right, but even, off into, it's been kind of appropriated by some of these people who don't like any government intervention, all kinds of things like that. You also have, Native American symbols, buffalo, things like that from sort of those strains. It's really all kinds of symbolism. It's hard to really go into a ton of detail because so much of this is just completely disparate theories that are being woven together into something that by all intents and logical purposes really shouldn't make any sense, but somehow they've tied it together to make sense.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting that there is so much kind of shared symbolism, but also different symbolism based on the particular strain, and in many ways that speaks to cultural uniqueness of the groups. You mentioned some of the groups that will use things like is Islamic symbols or Native American symbols. Yeah, that's interesting that people are able to sort of weave that together in a way that makes sense to them. So they're one of the the core things that seems to be part of this um, is, I mean, people talk about just the kind of the sovereign citizen, and I'm not subject by the government, but in large part, this seems to be about taxation, is what it seems like to me. And so, that how do they view taxation, and why do they not? I mean, why do they not feel like they have to pay their taxes? And just a note to the listeners, before we got on the podcast, when we were just bantering around, the three of us were talking about how we're it's late January, we're all starting to collect our W-2s and our 1099s and 1098s and all the forms we need to file our own tax returns. P.S. By the way, for the NSA or whoever's listening to the podcast, all of us pay our taxes. Don't worry. So, but these folks often don't, and don't feel like they need to. So what's going on with that, Dylan?
Well, so it's kind of and I don't want to as we talk about this, I want to make clear that we're not necessarily looking down on anyone, or judging anybody for having an argument that they believe that taxes may or may not need to be adjusted, or certain things shouldn't be taxed. What we are talking about is a group of people who categorically think that the concept of taxation is just shouldn't exist. It's illegitimate.
Yeah.
The very concept is not something that should happen. A lot of times people kind of stumble into this. Generally, when you have trouble paying your taxes, you tend to look for anything that will explain why you shouldn't have to, especially if you don't want to get in trouble for it. But basically, the theory goes that at some point, the government gets replaced. We had a good government. It got replaced by the bad government. One of the things that bad government did is get us off the gold standard. In 1933, we essentially left the gold standard, went to our sort of modern understanding of a fiat currency that we have. However, according to this theory, instead of going to a fiat currency, what the government did is they created what's known as a quote unquote straw man. It's a corporate variation of every single U.S. citizen. It's created upon their birth. It's evidenced by things like Social Security cards, driver's licenses, essentially any sort of government registration or ID, because, and this is how they sort of explain how you can identify the person versus the quote unquote corporate entity person, is the natural citizen has, a spelling like we normally would. They use upper and lowercase letters. It's just kind of how you would normally expect a name to look. But your driver's license, your birth and marriage certificates, these are frequently done in all caps, which they claim is a signal that this is the corporate straw man. The U.S. government created all these accounts in order to, instead of, have to pay for all of their debts with gold, they could essentially mortgage the earning power of all of their citizens, both current and future, in exchange for getting debt from other countries so that they could fund the government. So the idea that you have to pay taxes to an illegitimate government when they've already mortgaged essentially your entire livelihood as a form of wage slavery is what this kind of boils down to. And actually, many sovereigns believe that, and this is frequently where government officials will experience the sovereign, is when these people file, confusing looking documents with all kinds of weird language, strange forms to try and get at this account, because they believe that they can. They believe that if you use the right kind of forms at the right place, you can actually force the government to give you this money or let you access this money or pay your debts with this money instead of having to pay taxes to this illegitimate government.
So how much money are we talking about here that supposedly each of us has in our account, in our corporate person?
Well, that kind of depends. Depending on sort of which variation of the theory. I have seen anywhere from a couple $100,000 to tens of billions. per individual account.
And to play this out, it would also depend on the age of the person and things like that.
Well, so normally in a rational world, you would think that, but no. It's just kind of whatever magic number you want to claim that the government owes you is the magic number that you can say.
You kind of have, I mean, I can see this very much that they have the amount they want to get and they work back from there.
Exactly.
So they could
That's
actually
essentially what
use,
it is.
They could use they would use a formula that gives them that answer based upon how old they are.
In practice, that's what happens. So just, anecdotally, I deal with this in sort of my position working for the county court system. I actually, fun fact, you guys will enjoy this. I had a sovereign citizen file what they claimed was a judgment against me and a former judge and one of the attorneys that I deal with. I'm going to withhold names for privacy reasons and stuff, but it's almost $8 million. Mm-hmm. Split three ways. It's about $3 million in punitive damages for, and we're talking about a piece of property that happened to be worth maybe, I think, $15,000 or $20,000 before the tax delinquency comes in. I apparently owe almost $3 million myself, payable only in silver bullion to this person because of a supposed judgment that was filed against me. Now, without going into the weeds of how damages are normally awarded and for what reasons, this basically, the itemized list of what the bases for all these amounts was just completely made up. You've got a couple million here for this, 500,000 for this. It's just completely nonsensical. There's no basis in reality for the numbers that they use, but the government secretly has all this money.
I might be a little too reasonable here.
Probably.
If the government has this account for this person, are you a lawyer, an independent lawyer, somehow accessing that account?
No, but I'm in on the conspiracy. So that's part of the overarching conspiracy is that, so the government is illegitimate. Public officials who work in or for that government are in on the conspiracy. All judges and lawyers and other representatives of the legal system, we're in on it. We're perpetrating this mass conspiracy on the citizens of the country based through this weird, this is why you'll see sovereigns use certain legal phrases. They'll frequently borrow things from Black's Law Dictionary and especially old 18th and 19th century legal treatises and quote these phrases that they think mean certain things, because if you use the right version of these phrases in the right way, it essentially unlocks, it forces the government to bend to your will. The same government that they believe is illegitimate. So you have a bit of a catch-22 going on here as well.
That's really interesting. So I have one question for you, Dylan. So where do you keep all your silver bullion?
Well, my accountant couldn't exactly tell how we were supposed to handle this with our finance department, so I never did get a straight answer. I'm not going to tell anybody where I keep mine, just so that I make sure nobody shows up in the middle of the night. But needless to say, I don't have $3 million of it lying around.
No, not at all. So, well, it's interesting that you've had some, and undoubtedly in your line of work, that this is part of the reason why this has become of interest to you, is because you've had professional dealings with people that hold some of these views. So that is very interesting. So, Dylan, anything else? I mean, I think we've gotten a pretty good sense for what sort of views that are commonly held by sovereign citizens. Anything else to fill in the gaps?
No, it's kind of just one of those things that it's really interesting because it takes so many different variations on what you would think is a fairly consistent ideology. But when you dig under the surface, it really is there's all different variations that all believe in different forms. Some groups may not believe in this sort of collateralization in 1933. Some may believe that the government, should have stayed with the Articles of Confederation. That the historicity of it is what varies, but the fundamental point is that the government is illegitimate. Whatever government that you are having trouble with that you want to illegitimize, the answer is it's fake and it's not real and you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
I can't escape thinking about the Whiskey Rebellion when we started talking about this, kind of one of the earliest manifestations of this almost.
Essentially, actually, I've never thought about that as a direct sort of progenitor, but yeah, I mean, you could.
It is really.
I'm
very
sure
similar.
there's somebody who takes in, some of these, especially once you get into the sort of posse comitatus, tax protest, Ammon Bundy type movements. I am sure that at least some of them found the Whiskey Rebellion as the sort of, the sort of ancient example, of a rebellion. Almost like I'm sure. Various rebellions referenced, Spartacus as the sort of ancient example. So I'll have to think about
that does make a lot of sense. So if we're thinking about this, we're kind of coming back full circle to a fork in time. We're going to do this a little bit differently because, we're usually dealing with at least to the best of our ability, we're dealing with accuracy in historical events. And then we're changing those events with new events. This is a little bit different in that, this is a conspiracy theory that is, and again, we're not necessarily judging the people for having these views, but we are saying that these are views that are, have no basis in law and are internally inconsistent. So we can't really play it exactly the same way. But what we could do is kind of turn this on its head a little bit. And so are there any changes we could make in history that could make some of their arguments legitimate, or at least more legitimate?
Yeah, there's so the fun part about this is it's kind of take your historical event dartboard and throw something at it and you're going to land on something that could be changed.
True. Very true.
Probably the earliest, the obvious one is the US, shifting from the gold standard. What if instead of switching to a fiat currency, we actually did have the administrative and legal basis to create all these corporate strawman accounts and somehow expect the IRS through all of their sort of, political history to have managed to keep track of all this throughout the years. My personal favorite is the U.S. Moroccan Treaty of Perpetual Friendship from 1793, I want to say. It's the oldest continuously operating treaty between the United States and a foreign power. And there is a version of this sovereign citizen group movement. Their sort of heritage, they argue, comes from African and Islamic sort of heritage from the Moors who took over North Africa and went into Spain prior to some of them migrating to North America. They argue that because of their claimed historical heritage from these, what amount to foreign nations, that they and their property are not subject to the United States jurisdiction and in fact never have. Mm-hmm. That's the one that I feel like is the most, kind of bull in a china shop. If you want to make that true, then you have to imagine, okay, well, there are vast swaths of the United States that aren't actually legally territory or property of the United States. And what does that do to foreign relations, especially with, Morocco and modern nations like that? The jurisdictional question of, let's just say, for example, let's just take the entirety of South Carolina and say that it's the property of a completely different government and has been for the last 250 years.
So interesting you'd pick that state because what's going through my mind here is one of the, all of the examples we talk about of the manifestations of this are 20th century. The reason I'm thinking is because prior to that, American citizens did not have much of an interaction with revenuers, with income tax or anything like that. The interaction, the way they would fund is through tariffs. And South Carolina had a little bit of a history.
Yes, they did.
As an entire state, almost declaring things that sound a lot like some of these arguments you're making, where we don't agree with this, so we're just going to call the federal government illegitimate and refuse to do it.
Well, and the other thing is did the federal government, so this supposedly illegitimate federal government, and it's kind of nebulous as to what point in time they became illegitimate. So, right now I am sitting in Missouri, which is part of the Louisiana Purchase, not original part of the United States. So it was purchased from France. Is that an illegitimate purpose? So am I, and since I was also born and actually have lived my entire life in the area of the Louisiana Purchase, based on that, is it not legitimate? Am I actually a French citizen and not an American citizen? Because this part of what is generally considered the United States is still the property of France. Who knows? I don't know. That's a fun one to think about. So what would that look like in terms of the gold standard? So and this is maybe getting a little away from that, but what would that even look like from an economic standpoint in 2024? I mean, is that even tenable? It doesn't seem like it to me.
Well, I mean, like I said before, putting aside the the sort of bureaucratic and administrative impracticalities of, especially in 1933, keeping such a system entirely on paper, somehow accurate and current. If you just make all of the necessary assumptions that you have to make, that to get to the point where yes, the system works, is you essentially have, essentially every country in the world now does this system where their debt is essentially based on the potential earning power of their citizens over the lifetime that they have, which, how that would function. Do you have a sort of trading of earning power between citizens of one country and another? Do you have, what I'm really getting at is the actuarial industry essentially becomes the place. If you need a job, that's where you're going to go, because actuarial tables of who's born when, what they do, what their likely earning potential is, becomes, rather than sort of stock trading or equities and hedge funds and the sort of, international network of stock exchanges,
Yeah.
you essentially have a work product exchange instead.
Yeah, that
where
that makes. I mean, it makes sense in that it doesn't make sense.
it's probably.
I'm just going to go ahead and ask: does Eric count towards the American debt or the French debt?
Yeah.
Well, that depends on which way we want to take this, or since most of us, reside in, states that were formerly, or were born in states that were formerly, members of the Confederate States in the Civil War, that's another area where people argue that because the federal government, victorious in the Civil War, essentially forced the Southern states, so the argument goes, into new governments without the consent of the people, those governments are then illegitimate. So are we then, sort of work product employee collateral of the Confederate States, or does our work product count towards the republic, the independent Republic of Tennessee, or of southwestern Missouri, or of Texas, or things like that? It's the only thing I can think of is that even though most of these people probably have an, almost like a rabies victim's fear of water, these people probably have an equivalent fear of anything kind of resembling socialism or communistic tendencies. This is probably the closest to a capitalist, socialist international market economy that we will ever get if you base the value of a country off of the work product of their citizens. It is the proletarian market come to life, which is kind of the cosmic irony of this whole thing. So maybe the Soviet Union would be, the number one market leader in the world. I don't know.
That's interesting. So that any other departures you can think of, Dylan, that would be particularly interesting, that might make this a little bit more legitimate, or at least at least somewhat internally consistent.
Well, I think if you had, if the argument became sort of a little bit more internally consistent, you may be able to see kind of a heritage coming out of the sort of John Calhoun, Henry Clay, state supremacy over federal law, the ability to essentially nullify inapplicable laws that the citizens of the state found themselves essentially forced into by an illegitimate government. That may be something that you could see essentially, more of a sort of states' rights. I hate that phrase because of the connotations that it comes with, but from a if you're actually truly talking about the rights of a state for self-determination of their own affairs, if you take that sort of Henry Clay, John Calhoun example and extrapolate it, that's probably the closest that we would get to a sort of workable historical version of this.
I can see that.
We haven't talked about the 16th Amendment, but I think that's important. That could be important for this.
So the 14th Amendment is usually one of the reasons for this. The other Civil War amendments, not so much.
No.
Although they do the income tax stuff.
The income tax. That's what we're thinking of, the income tax. Yeah.
Yeah. And that would be the argument is that, and some sovereigns do make this argument, but it's not just income taxation for the sovereigns. It's taxation by the government generally of any kind. Property taxation is real common. Not only income taxation, but all the other stuff, just taxation in general. Essentially, the government becomes a sort of, a Jeffersonian, philosophical communion of like minds with nothing more than that binding two individuals together under this sort of sovereign, ideal, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially like an anarcho-libertarian utopia is the best way that I can describe it.
Which doesn't sound very utopian.
Oh, there goes the irony.
So I have a question. This may be kind of delving back in this, and these are people that they feel like all taxation is illegitimate. So do they then forego any sort of potential benefits from taxation?
Yes. That's normally how this works and this is the idea of that the government, this sort of obligation to the government is forced upon them. So like the example that, people may be most familiar with, especially in the US, is Terry Nichols, who was Timothy McVeigh's buddy from the Oklahoma City bombing. It turns out, I want to say it was 2 years before the bombing, he actually sent a letter to the Michigan Department of Natural Resources canceling his hunting license because he claimed that it was a contract with the state government. So that's what this becomes, is this rejection of any and all state benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Because with the taxation is the counterpoint to those benefits. You're essentially, to sort of condense the theory, by engaging and receiving benefits from the state, you're consenting to the contract that obligates you to pay taxes for those benefits. And if you want to escape the tax obligation, you refuse the benefits, and you essentially basically become a survivalist, completely self-sufficient, beholden to no one, so that you can escape from this burden of contracting with the federal government, the state government, for taxes.
Okay. Interesting. Huh.
Yeah, it's very fascinating stuff. It comes from all different corners. There's all kinds of psychology that comes into it. It's if you can keep your sanity, it's one of the reasons I like it is because it's very little studied. Most of the people that deal with it don't realize, or don't have to worry about it enough that they realize that it is a fully functional ideology. Whether it's internally consistent is a different story, but it is a fully functional worldview, just like many other, political systems that we're used to talking about on a regular basis.
And have more recent conspiracy theories that may be in kind of similar political leanings, have they influenced us at all? And the one that comes to mind is QAnon. Is there any crosstalk there, or are there people who may hold sovereign citizen views and may also be subscribers to QAnon?
So just from a practical perspective, I can almost guarantee you that at least some QAnon supporters are, also sovereigns.
Yeah.
Whether, they're the sort of tax protest illegitimacy of the government belief is very much common in both. I am sure there are some sovereign citizens who believe that most of the Washington elite is secretly, stealing blood from children so that they can become immortal in the basement of a pizza restaurant in D.C.
Yeah.
But
Not even that good a restaurant.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
Also,
Well,
blueprints are a publicly available thing. Like, you can look and see if there's a basement. But
and there's
anyway,
no basement.
Exactly. So there are sort of kind of the general points of both, are very much in common. To be perfectly honest, I think QAnon is such a recent thing.
Yeah.
Only being from the last 5-6 years. I think in terms of a cohesive link, it's hard. It hasn't quite had time to truly weave itself into the sort of fabric of sovereign citizen ideology. But I would, to be perfectly honest, I'd be surprised if it didn't become more prevalent in 10 years, maybe.
It seems like it might appeal. They both might appeal to people with similar grievances against the government. So
exactly,
that's kind of why I asked it that way. So that's interesting.
And actually, some of the one of the types of this movement is very much tied to the kind of militia, the American militia movement that is also very prevalent in the QAnon movement. So some of the groups like and I'm throwing this one out because it's the one people are going to be most familiar with if you keep track of American news, groups like the Oath Keepers.
Yeah.
You could make an argument that they, even if they're not necessarily full sovereign citizen, they are very sovereign citizen adjacent.
Yeah.
Because of their beliefs about the illegitimacy of the government. So I'm willing to bet that in about 10 years or so, you're going to start seeing some real cross germination between this, and it's going to essentially become one giant blob, because that's what this movement does. Is it incorporates any sort of strange, excerpt that also happens to justify that the government is illegitimate, and it incorporates it and finds a way to synchronize it with everything that's come before it. I will say one fun fact I did discover in the middle of this. Not only do sovereign citizens exist, they apparently also have an unofficial celebrity spokesman.
Oh, who is that?
Jared Fogle, the Subway guy.
Oh, dear.
Yes. So Jared Fogle, short version, he was imprisoned after becoming famous for losing all that weight thanks to eating only $5 footlongs, which just from a nutritional standpoint, I know Eric's the doctor, but I don't think that's really nutritionally how that works.
No, not really.
No, I am going to go ahead and pause for a second here. His imprisonment had nothing to do with the weight loss.
No, it had everything to do with some other things that we don't necessarily even want to bring up. But the reason I know he's a sovereign citizen is because he actually filed an appeal of his conviction based on the argument that the court did not have subject matter jurisdiction over him because he was a sovereign. Fortunately, he lost that appeal. The court noted that he had in fact pled guilty, which to give a quick, criminal procedure refresher means that you accept that the government has jurisdiction. So because he had already said that they did, he couldn't back out of it now. So he is still safely behind bars.
There is no legal precedent for just takesies backsies because I wanna.
Although, and this is kind of going off topic, we do have a Tennessee state legislature who did in fact try that essentially very argument, was that I would like to takesies backsies my guilty plea when he was in danger of losing his seat. But that's a whole nother story. So no, that is not in fact a legally recognizable defense.
Okay, that's good to know. So, but we even though we completely trust Dylan's legal mind, we would also say don't take legal advice from a podcast. Just like I say, don't take medical advice from a podcast.
Yes, my standard legal disclaimer applies. If you none of this has been specific legal advice, talk to a professional. Yep. If you're at all worried about taking legal advice from this particular episode, I would strongly suggest you may have to reevaluate multiple things about what's going on with your life. So I'm just going to put that out there.
All right. Well, no, that's a good disclaimer. Thank you for that, Dylan. Anything else before we wrap this episode up and the Fork and Time team go back to compiling our income taxes?
No, I think that's it for now.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dylan, for joining me today. This was a really interesting discussion, Dylan. Thank you. I learned a ton. I mean, what I knew about the sovereign citizen movement was really a thimbleful compared to what's actually there. So, thank you for putting a lot of meat on those bones. It was very interesting. Chris, anything else that you want to add to this?
Nothing necessarily jumps to mind.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, again, thank you all for joining us on the Fork and Time. So, Dylan, I'll let you in this. If there's a fork in time,
take it and make sure you pay your taxes with it.
Very good. All right. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.